Yes, hi everybody. Good evening. We're back, the Contrarians. We have a cool Patreon discussion tonight. And I just noticed Reed is wearing the shirt. That's awesome. Thanks for repping the Contrarian shirt, Reed. So we do have t-shirts at TeePublic. The link is in the description. But we're here. Our awesome patrons are back, and we're going to have another panel discussion on somewhat of a polarizing album for some folks. We're going to talk about, as you can see in my background, UFO Mechanix. Tonight, we're going to go around, get each person's opinion. Martin's going to jump on in about a minute, and we're going to get his opinion on it as well. And we're going to each rate the album out of 10, and then we're going to do an average rating at the end of this. Just to start things off, I guess I'll just go through some statistics real quick, like we do in our normal episodes. I thought it'd be interesting to introduce this in our panel discussions. So just in terms of just a couple of rankings lists that I looked at, if you look at best ever albums, Mechanix comes in at number 12 in that list, and right above it is Making Contact, and number 1 is, and I'll tell you just a second. Number 1 is Strangers in the Night. Number 2 is Lights Out. Number 3 is Phenomenon. For Ranker.com, they have Mechanix in at number 7. And this is folks from like viewers and listeners are ranking these albums. Number 8 was No Place to Run, which is interesting. That was actually the topic of our UFO Contrarians episode, was No Place to Run. That came in at 8. And number 1 on that list is Lights Out. Number 2 is Phenomenon, and number 3 is Force It. Ultimate Classic Rock has Mechanix at number 7. This is their little write-up of Mechanix. They said the cover art gracing 1982's Mechanix looked like the work of an 8-year-old with an unhealthy interest in heavy tools, fetish guitar, and guitar necks. But the songs within notched another win for the British hard rock veterans as they braved the new decade ahead. A distinctly heavier guitar tone offset the interloping synthesizers, courtesy of former Wild Horse and future Gary Moore keyboardist Neil Carter, cropping up on The Writer, Terry, and other tunes for progress that didn't feel forced. So number 1 on this list is Lights Out. Number 2 is Force It. Number 3 is Phenomenon. Let's see what else I have up here. Let's just look at some album sales. So none of UFO's albums famously are very certified in the US. They don't really have a lot of high charting albums. Mechanix is no different. In the US, Mechanix charted at number 82. Their highest charting album in the US is Lights Out, followed by Obsession. So those are their 2 highest charting albums. And yeah, I guess that's pretty good. AllMusic gave Mechanix a 2.5 out of 5 stars. And then Force It, Phenomenon, Lights Out, they all got 4 stars or more. Strangers in the Night got 5 stars. No Place to Run got 4 stars. So it's pretty low rating on a lot of these lists. And it got a pretty low, well, it got a 2.5 stars on AllMusic. And it's one of the lower rated ones on AllMusic. So that's just a few album statistics like we normally do in our shows. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw it over to one of our patrons, and you can tell me if you're yay or nay on the album, what your thoughts are on the album, and then give us a rating out of 10. So why don't we start with Nick Esquire? Take it away, Nick.
Oh, good. Thanks, Margo. Yeah, I know when we were presented with this album and the idea that maybe it's polarizing, I wasn't aware of any controversy, but I love this album. I think it's, I know that Martin had done a Contrarian episode with No Place to Run as his Contrarian choice, and it was a good choice, and I get it. I didn't necessarily agree, but that's a great album. But I think Mechanix is every bit as good as No Place to Run. I think all the Chapman era albums are solid, but I really like this album. You've got heavy drums, you've got crunchy guitars, you've got great vocal melodies. If you like rock and roll distilled to its bare essence, this is the kind of album that you would like. There's keyboards on it, but they're not dated. They're sort of they're elegant or they're tasteful, if you will. I think the originals are great. I think anytime you do a cover of Eddie Cochran, you know something, because Eddie Cochran is maybe the ultimate contrarian artist. He's fantastic. So and they pull that cover off very well. I came to even get Mechanix or understand Mechanix through this CD when I was kind of learning about UFO, The Best of the Rest, which was a great sort of greatest hits of the Chapman years. And then of course I finally picked it up on vinyl, of course, but I like this album. If you were to ask me to give it a rating, I'd say according to other UFO albums, I'd give it a solid 8 out of 10. I think it's up there. It's probably a top fiver for me in the UFO canon. I'm a Lights Out guy. It was the first UFO album I got hooked on UFO because of Lights Out, and others, may float up and down interchangeably. That would be number one for me. Obsession maybe number two. I'm a big Walk on Water fan. It's an imperfect album, but this album's right up in there. I think it's real solid. So I think it's much better than the one after, which
Making Contact.
Thank you, Making Contact, and I like it better than the album before. So I think
Wild,
it's
Willing, and the Innocent. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's better, but I like the production. So for me, it's a definite yay.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. So I'm writing everybody's number down and I'm going to have an average at the end. And just to catch you up, Martin, I basically just went through some album statistics like I normally do on the shows. So this Mechanix, if you look at like the research, the ranking stuff, it usually falls in either kind of low or in the middle of the pack in terms of the albums. That's kind of just a sum of the things. Some of the stuff that gets criticized is the album cover, of course. So I kind of just did that and Nick gave us his rating. But yeah, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to throw it over to Reed. Let's hear from you, Reed. What do you think?
Oh, okay. Well, I always like to establish a little context first. So I'm an extremely casual UFO fan. I mostly knew of UFO rather than knowing their music. And that was because people like Dave Mustaine list Michael Schenker as a big influence. A lot of the thrash bands did. So I bought the album Lights Out in probably the early 2000s, because I'd never really listened to Michael Schenker. And while I like 3 or 4 songs on it, I wasn't super impressed by it. And that was kind of it for a long time. I went and saw UFO during the Vinnie Moore era. I was going to see any band that came to town that I'd never seen before that was kind of in my genre. So I went to see UFO. Don't remember anything about the concert. So it's safe to say UFO is a band I don't dislike, but I wasn't really into them. And then when I started exploring the music of the 70s, I decided to get some UFO, and I got this boxed set that had everything up to Misdemeanor. So I listened to all of them one after the other. And weirdly, it didn't really change my impression very much. I like 3 or 4 songs off of each album. And, there wasn't really much I disliked, but it didn't really do it for me. And coincidentally, I just read Martin's book on UFO, picked that up on Zunier. And it's so frustrating reading how those guys continuously torpedo their own career. So real characters, apparently. But so I pulled Mechanix out to listen to it for this episode, expecting to have no reaction to it at all. And much to my surprise, I really enjoyed it. So coming in basically from nothing, I don't have a strong opinion on what UFO ought to sound like or should sound like. I'm not a huge Michael Schenker fan. Can't really pick his playing out of a lineup other than the song Lights Out and a couple of things from the Michael Schenker group that guitarists are always noodling on for one reason or another. But I really enjoyed it. I think it's got great sound. The guitars sound muscular. The singing is great. I actually love the keyboards on it, right? This album or Mechanix came out in 82. And for some reason, that was when heavy metal was changing from, there had been keyboards on hard rock all through the 70s. And in the early 80s, it was suddenly, you can't have keyboards on metal. And I remember being one of those kids, right? In the early 80s, you're like, if there's keyboards on it, it's not heavy metal. I don't want to listen to it. Now I think it's great. I listen to it and go, man, that keyboard in the background really adds something. The first time I listened to it, Something Else, the Eddie Cochran song that you already mentioned, I was like, is this the Blues Brothers? What just happened to my UFO album? So it's a bit jarring. And believe it or not, there are a couple of songs on this album that remind me of Tom Petty, kind of in the vocal melodies, in the choruses especially. It's very Tom Petty-ish. And also there are a couple of tracks that are very Thin Lizzy. And interestingly, I'm a big Thin Lizzy fan, even though I never quite crossed over into UFO. I think I love every song on it, but one of the ballads, let me see here. Which one is it? Sorry, I've got my notes
Back
here.
Into My Life, maybe?
No, actually it's Terry, which is sad. My wife is named Terry, and I would love to have a song with her name on it that I love, but it's a really boring song. And I thought, is this the worst ballad they've ever done? And then I went back and listened to Lights Out again and went, oh, they were never good at ballads, in my opinion. I love the really muscular hard rock stuff from UFO, but the ballads, maybe not so much. But other than that, perhaps my favorite song on it, I really love Doing It All For You. It actually reminded me just a little bit of Abominog era Uriah Heep, which weirdly also came out in 1982. So there's like old British rock bands were kind of hitting that hard rock commercial zone right at the beginning of the 80s where they didn't really know which direction to go. And as a young man, I didn't care for it, but now I really like it. So I'm probably going to give it 7 out of 10.
Pretty high, actually. Very
I've
cool.
listened to it half a dozen times in preparation for this show and liked it every time. So yeah.
Cool, Reed, thank you. Why don't I go next? I'll go really quickly. I pretty much agree with Reed. I'm not like a super UFO fan, but I am familiar with some of their material, and I've listened to this album, and I agree with Reed. It's pretty good. There are some, like the first track right off the bat is awesome. You know, it came out in 1982. Some other stuff that was coming out around that time was, you know, like the new wave of British heavy metal. So you had stuff like Saxon coming out at this time, right? And honestly, like I thought some of the even like guitar work is pretty heavy, like on You'll Get Love, or sorry, yeah, You'll Get Love. I found the guitar work on that from Paul Chapman to be pretty heavy, like compared to what was going on at the time, you know. And like I thought Phil Mogg's performance was very good. I thought I agreed with Reed totally that like I do think there are places in the arrangements where the keyboards work. Like I think overall it's a pretty solid album. I like the first track a lot. One track, what interested me was one track that right off the bat I did not connect with on an emotional level was the track that I thought you were talking about, Reed, Back Into My Life, which kind of reminds me of kind of like a Night Moves, Bob Seger type of thing. That to me, I don't know if, you know, I thought the first couple of tracks were good. The track after Back Into My Life, You'll Get Love, was good. That track just, I don't know, didn't made me feel a certain way about the album. Like I just didn't like it. I don't know if it was, I kept thinking of Night Moves, and maybe it slowed things down too much for me, or the tempo came down too much for me on that track. But I felt overall, this definitely, if I was going to rate it out of 10, is a pass for me. I might not give it like an 8 or 9 out of 10, but I would totally agree with Reed and say, yeah, it's definitely at least a 7 for sure. There are some really good tunes on this. There's some really good arrangements, really good performance. Yeah, you know what? Probably 7.5, I would say. And then, yeah, like Reed said, Terry, Back Into My Life. There were a couple of low points on the album for me, which maybe stop it from becoming like an 8 out of 10. But the Back Into My Life just totally, I don't know if they were trying to write a single or what with that, but it just reeked of Night Moves. And I like Night Moves, just not this song.
You know, and Back Into My Life is one of the ones that most reminded me of Thin Lizzy.
I got
Of course,
the Bob Seger feeling from
by
it,
82, Thin Lizzy was kind of passe. So
awesome. So we got a 8, 7, 7.5. So we're doing pretty good here. So why don't I throw it over to Joe B next? Why don't you tell us what you thought of the album, Joe?
Hello, Contrarians. Hello, everybody. First of all, UFO, I mean, you gave the stats nationally in the United States, but UFO in Chicago, as I mentioned before, was absolutely huge. And they were a platinum artist here. And we had the perception they were up there with Zeppelin and all the other big bands. And they were played a lot in the radio. One of the reasons, because Strangers of the Night in the Night was recorded in Chicago, and Shaker was huge here in Chicago. Strangers in the Night is my absolute favorite UFO album. But this album, Mechanix, I'm going to go full contrarian here. This is my favorite studio album by UFO. I absolutely love this album. You bring up the slower songs on here. I know Phil Mogg is a huge Springsteen fan. So I think you hear a little bit of that when he, lyrically tries to emulate that. But the album just goes, first of all, here's a good story. And this is the contrarian polarization. I've been in actually a few physical confrontations over music. And one of them was, I was working at a radio station in college, and I told him I like Chapman era UFO just as much as Shaker era UFO, and he went at me, and they had to separate. So that's how crazy it was back then. But yeah, I mean, you go into the writer, something else, and then they dial it back into my life, and then this album goes through You'll Get Love, Doing It All for You, and Martin, when he did the tribute to Paul Chapman when he passed away, that middle section, that jam, is absolutely incredible, and I think that's UFO at their best. And then We Belong Tonight, Let It Rain, that when Paul Chapman hits the flanger, it still gives me shivers up and down my spine. I listened to it the other day. It's so cool. And then they dial it back with Terry, but then Feel It and Dreaming. Andy Parker's fantastic on the drums here. It's pounding. I love the production. I absolutely love this album. The early Shanker albums, I think Ron Nevison's production was a little thin. That's why I love Strangers in the Night so much. But this album, as far as a studio album, is my absolute favorite by UFO. So I give it a 9 out of 10. Just a great album. I think the contrarian argument here is Chapman versus Shanker UFO. So.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Joe. Continuing the trend of high ratings. Cool. Why don't we hear from Ryan next?
All right. So UFO is a band that I've been into for a while now, probably about 10 years. I got into them when I was around 14 years old. Started off with albums like Lights Out, Strangers in the Night. I got those Chrysalis Year box sets on CD. First one having all the Shanker albums, second one having all the Paul Chapman albums, and then Misdemeanor. And I also got into some of their space rock stuff, which I actually really do like quite a bit. I think it's an interesting time for the band. And for a long time, I had a very positive opinion about Mechanix. It was actually like one of my favorite UFO albums when I was growing up. And so I've been revisiting it recently for this, and I can't really say the same thing anymore. I think it's a decent album, but I think that it's kind of the moment for me when UFO kind of jumped the shark. And I don't think they've ever really come back since. I think that there's some really good songs on this album. I think The Writer is a pretty cool, heavy song. I think that We Belong to the Night's a cool, like, power poppy metal song. It's interesting. I think Let It Rain is a great song, great like pop tune. And then Feel It and Dreaming are good. But other than that, I think the songs are pretty unforgettable. Pretty forgettable. I really don't like that cover of Something Else. It's pretty boring. It's like energetic and stuff, but at the same time, it just sounds so cliche of like 80s rock. Kind of sounds like a Huey Lewis type of thing. And I really don't like that for UFO. Marco, I thought it was funny that you mentioned Bob Seger for Back Into My Life, because that was the same exact thing that I was thinking with that song. And I think that's kind of my problem with a lot of the songs in this album. It sounds like they were trying really hard to get that American commercial success, but they like failed at it. And with songs like that, it's like almost like a certain lack of awareness of how to do it right with those kind of songs. And it just comes across as more awkward than anything. I think that Terry's terrible. It actually kind of reminds me of Shandy from Kiss Unmasked a lot, but I think Shandy's actually a better song. What else here? You'll Get Love is okay. doing it all for you. Really cool intro on that song. Cool chorus, kind of dreamy, but there's like some parts in the verse where he just has some melodic choices vocally that I just think sound really dumb. And I think that's another thing that I also kind of noticed with this album. It seems like there was a lack of discipline production wise. Like they didn't have somebody to tell them, okay, no, that sounds a little bit stupid there. That sounds a little stupid there. So there's just some little moments like that. I think a lot of the songs have great ideas, but there's just certain choices that are made throughout that I don't really like. But other than that, like I feel like I don't have a whole lot more to say about this album. Like I think that, if I think about like peak UFO for me, it really is like albums like No Heavy Petting, Force It. I actually like the two Paul Chapman albums a lot more that came before this, No Place to Run and Wild, the Willing, and the Innocent. I think those are both fantastic albums. And then I think Strangers in the Night, Lights Out, Obsession, I think all those are pretty amazing too. And like I said, the space rock stuff, I love all that. I feel like this one was where UFO went downhill for me. And then Making Contact went even more downhill. Misdemeanor, I have like a certain guilty pleasure with, but it's a much worse album than this one. It's a much worse album than Making Contact. And then they kind of just stopped being interesting to me from there on. And that's just my opinion on that. But I'd say if I had to give this album a rating, I'd give it maybe like a 5.5.
Wow. Cool.
We need a couple of opinions, a couple of different opinions, so that's good. Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. Peter, why don't you take it away?
Rightio.
Right.
I'll give a bit of context about my view on this album. So UFO started off 1968, space rock. I think they had Bernie Marsden in their ranks briefly. I would say that this band was probably second or third division, solid. They happened to jag an 18-year-old genius guitarist called Michael Schenker, and then the journey begins. And leading up to Mechanix, I think the big thing that hangs over the Paul Chapman years, and I call it the meat and potatoes era because it's solid, but I think that everything that this guy here hangs over the album of Mechanix in the Paul Chapman era, and it's usually because of this album here. So you had Michael Schenker that, he's a genius. He was brought into a band, lifted it into, this band into the cusp of the first division. Every album they made from 1974 was getting better and better and better and better. Even though the studio albums, they couldn't quite replicate that live sound. And, every album had a little bit of filler, but, the Piece de Resistance, this live album. And, to consider that, they basically didn't communicate. Michael Schenker, couldn't speak English hardly. And the band was fractious, a lot of substance abuse, and they happened to make fantastic music, but every single album you can see a progression. They were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and as Joe said, they were heroes in Middle America and the lower parts of America, like Texas. You read stories, they were just a huge draw card, and they were just getting huge. And so Schenker goes off, he goes into MSG, and then you've got the Paul Chapman years, and this leads into what I think of Mechanix. So with Mechanix, I think it's under the shadow. Everything that the Paul Chapman years is in the shadow of that Michael Schenker era. And I think that really, if Schenker was still in the band with UFO, they would have probably peaked around 1980. They would have peaked around 1981, and they would have had that masterpiece. They were just on the cusp. They got the live masterpiece, but in respect of a studio album, I think they were just getting closer and closer, and then Schenker went off and did MSG, and then you had the Paul Chapman years. And that's not to say any reflection with Paul Chapman, solid guitarist, great guitar work, good band, but it's always in the shadow of the Michael Schenker era. And it's just the way it is, and that's the way I see it. So with Mechanix, I think that it's pretty uninspiring. I think there's a lot of tracks on it that are just sort of that era. And when you had UFO that were inspiring bands like your Def Leppards, your Iron Maidens, this album was actually following the pack, not leading the pack. Instead of being at the vanguard of the new wave of British heavy metal, it was like they took a step back and they were just trying to keep up. And, you know, this album cover, you know, the glove and the spanner, what are they trying to say? I'm trying to fix something. Am I trying to, there's something wrong in, the previous album. I better get the spanner out and fix it. What sort of statement are they putting out? So I've written some notes in regards to some of the, I've listened to the album all week. So I've first track, The Rider. I put it as middling Billy Squire. That's something else. I made that as, that's pretty dire, that Eddie Cochran sort of cover song. I don't think horns make necessarily a better song. Back into My Life, I wrote down Van Morrison, Hothouse Flowers B-side. You'll Get Love. I think that's an interesting song. It's got some good chord progressions, great guitar work, good lead break. Doing It All For You. That's a bit of an interesting song because it sounds like you've got two songs in one. It's like dual personalities. You've got one that's a bit riffy and then it goes into a slow ballady song, then it goes back riffy. So it's a little bit schizophrenic. It's a bit dual personality, a bit jarring. We Belong to the Night. I think that's a corker. I love that. It's the best song on the album, got a good groove. That's a stonker. Let It Rain. I always found that a little bit middling. Terry is terrible. Power ballad. It's got these chord progressions that I've listened to so many AOR bands. I can't put my finger on it because it sounded like a Heart song, and I was listening to all these Heart songs last night, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Feel It. The opening riff, I said, sounds like All Right Now by Free. And then it finishes with Dreaming, and that's a good stonking track at the end. But it's too late. The album's over. And even the topics they cover, it's this, I was reading the lyrics. It's the same old stuff of Ladies of the Night, Love Gone Wrong, Groupies, and, having a pot shot at the Fleet Street Press. The good parts to this album is the drum sounds huge. So the Andee Parker is just absolutely having a field day. So they've really got the drum sound down pat on this album, and some really good guitar work with Paul Chapman. But again, I still think that this is a prime example of an album that's just in the shadow of Michael Schenker, because that, Strangers in the Night is one of the all-time great live albums, and their work previous to that. So, sorry, a bit of a Grinch at Christmas, but I have to give this album maybe a 4 out of 10.
Wow.
So Peter, you brought up some, actually, I don't know if it was Pete Way's book or another one I read, and someone was quoted saying that if Schenker would have stayed in the band and if Phil Mugg stopped trying to be Bruce Springsteen, they would have been huge.
Yeah.
But yeah, you made me think of that when you did the comparison.
They were on the up. I think there was gold. There was like not lightning in a bottle if they were all together, but they just couldn't get on, and they just imploded. And I think Reed said it earlier, just the interesting reading Martin's book and all the dynamics and the stage shenanigans. But if they just kept it going, I think they would have just been like Iron Maiden huge and even bigger.
Yeah, I don't see it. Not from that era. And I know Martin hasn't gone yet. Sorry, Martin. I know they did not have that kind of impact in the MTV era. 1982, we're talking MTV. If you
Yeah,
weren't
but
on MTV
this
in
happened
the
just
US,
before the MTV era.
well, I mean, 82
Yeah.
is when MTV started, yeah, but I mean, they were not getting the exposure. And I think the only way Schenker was ever going to be huge was, one, if he pulled his head out, and two, if he joined the Scorpions on a permanent basis, because they were just about to light the world on fire. But they
Yeah.
left UFO long in the dust.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Martin, or whoever. Schenker left in '79. This is pre-MTV. So by leaving the band, the momentum, it's like you're in a sports team. You lose your most valuable player and you lose momentum.
I mean,
you're scrambling. And
and
that
I'm
was
with you
just
on
before
that.
MTV broke.
But I'm just saying that
Mm.
Schenker never accomplished anything on his own either. I mean, he was a solid mid-tier performer, but he never reached the stratosphere, not like his brother.
Because he needed
Well-
Moog, Way, and all the others. It's a
Interesting
combination.
points. Yeah,
Ron,
good points.
Ron Nevison also is on record saying that now Ron Nevison worked with Clapton and all these other great guitarists. And he said Michael Schenker, hands down, was the greatest guitarist he ever worked with.
Yeah. I mean,
Awesome.
I'm a Blackmore fan, but Schenker's number 2. The tone is just like outer worldly. He's just
All right, well, why don't we throw it over to Martin, hear what you think about UFO. I want to see if your
Wow.
rating stays the same as it was when you put out your book.
Yeah, my head's exploding here. So just to mention a few things. So it's really interesting. I love Peter, that idea of the albums getting better and better, and they could have been huge is a really interesting analysis. And I really do like that. And I think Schenker didn't get better because of the stupid name of the band, Michael's abrasive personality and eccentric personality at the time, and the fact that they're changing lead singers all the time and other members. So I think they had hiccups along the way. I mean, they could have been big, but yeah, I mean, I even think just the name of the band itself was enough to kind of like Deep Six, the Michael Schenker group as something that was going to be huge. But that's really cool. You're right. The albums got better and better and better, and then you get that live album, and what they have done afterwards? It's fascinating, right? And Joe, I totally agree with you that yeah, I love that riff that comes in doing it all for you. That is my favorite part of this album. It's probably almost my favorite part of this whole era. So for me, and I'll also agree with you, Joe, that I'm also contrarian in that I just when you're watching an NFL game and you don't really have a horse in the race and you don't know who you're going for. I just had this conversation with my family, and all of a sudden you start rooting for one team over the other and you have no control over it, right? And then every play you are rooting for that team, and you stand back and go, oh, I guess that's who I was going for, but I have no control over it. That's how I feel about the Chapman stuff. I have no control over it. I love the Chapman era more than the Schenker era. The Schenker era just kind of leaves me a little cold. I don't think Ron Nevison's productions are particularly good. And I just love the songwriting on the Paul Chapman era. Now, having said that, my favorite is No Place to Run. And to me, that's their Ready and Willing. That's their regal, serious, cool album. Dark. I love even the mellow stuff on it. I think they do good ballads on that album. So all the mellow stuff on there is good. All the heavy stuff on there is good. And it's got a really organic, strange production from George Martin. The second one I really like a lot as well. I think that has a lot of charm and personality. But Mechanix, there's my copy framed up that I've got hanging. So it's got 4 guys on it. It doesn't have Neil on it, but it's got a Mechanix tour like this. The Past looks like this, and I thought that looked really cool. And this old style one here says UFO headliner, and the backup band AC/DC. So there you go. But so when you get to Mechanix, I remember as a kid us being really ticked off at this album. And I thought the production, and even still, the production of it is a funny one, because I've heard you guys have different attitudes on the production. Are the drums big? Possibly, but are the drums boomy and in there and sort of like, completely organically put together in a distorted, heavy, noisy way with everything else? I think that's what happens on this album. I think it's a very mid-rangey production. But it all feels like a band really together in like a dirty barroom sort of production way. And this is Gary Lyons. Gary Lyons was a party guy. He was a druggy guy. He was not leading, as you guys have astutely said, he was not really leading the band, and this band needed some leaders, right? It needed someone to really like crack the whip, and they weren't getting that. So the production's kind of a funny thing on this album. I think the production is better on the previous two, and arguably even better on Making Contact, although it's kind of like clinical and austere on that. But to me, this is the exciting production of the four albums, right? And that's what I like about it. Now, Ryan, the interesting thing that you said, I agree with almost everything you said, Ryan, on this album, but it's almost like I'm agreeing with everything, but then I'm fine with everything that the way you described it, and my marks would be much higher, because I love when you said that this is where they jump the shark a little bit, right? And then they jump the shark some more on the next one, and even more on the next one. But they do that here, and I remember as a kid, we just hated something else on this album, right? But the rest of it, I quite like. I like this idea of, in 1982, they're doing this sort of nascent rainbow, late period Foreigner, Night Ranger sort of idea of the Americanizing of it, which they had naturally anyways, because Phil is a big, Bruce Springsteen guy. We got John Mellencamp starting to get big, Bryan Adams starting to get big. So there is that element on it with songs like Terry, you're right. I mean, and it's funny, the Heart one, there's a Heart song that is actually about, it rhymes with Terry, and it's about a male guy. And I can't remember, is it Carrie that they're talking about there? But there is a Heart song, you're right, that is similar to that. And it's not one of the great songs on it. But Let It Rain is kind of the big one in that direction. But I do like all the heavy stuff on it. I like We Belong to the Night a lot. I think the writer is really cool. You've got a very big Pete Way feel about this album as well. This is the album where Neil Carter's writing started coming more into the fore. He just joined kind of late in the period for Wild and the Willing, but this is where he's getting more involved. But to me, this feels like a mix of a Neil Carter album, but it also, in spirit, even though Pete Way is, he's well enough into the credits, but this really feels like a Pete Way album to me, exemplified, I suppose, by Something Else. And I agree that the horns are ridiculous on Something Else. But to me, I think the dark horse song on this album is the final track, Dreaming. I think Dreaming just brings it all together in a melodic and heavy way, whereas We Belong to the Night and the Writer are just more rote heavy metal. But Dreaming is like, brings in the magic of UFO along with the heavy metal and the great grooves, and Andy Parker sounds great on it. So again, I guess to recap, the funny thing is, I totally remember feeling as a kid, this was the album that did, as you say, Ryan, jump the shark. And we were ticked off at UFO at this time, and we were moving on to other things. But over the years, I've gotten to appreciate it more and more and more. And sometimes I'm like, the academic in me and the music snob in me wants to say Wild and Willing is the better album. But the guilty pleasure part of me wants to say Mechanix is the better album, although I'll never say anything's better than No Place to Run, because that is absolutely my favorite. That one feels like a masterpiece to me. Every single direction they went in on that, I think they nailed it, whether it was the heavy stuff, the mellow stuff, the Stonesy, Pete Way stuff, whatever. I think it's just something, the George Martin cloak on it, and recording it at Montserrat and all that kind of stuff just makes that record seem like the regal royal UFO album of the Paul Chapman era. But this is really the guilty pleasure. And I probably, again, go back to that NFL game situation. I just find myself surrendering to this record more than Wild and Willing and the Innocent, which feels more of a scholarly thing. So grade wise, I think I would have to give Mechanix, because there are a lot of parts that kind of fall down on it. I would say I'm going to go with an 8.5 on Mechanix.
Nice. So it's gone up a 0.5 from your heavy metal review.
Oh, has
guide.
it? Okay.
Yeah, you're an 8 on the heavy metal review.
Well,
guide.
that totally makes sense, because it's the one I like I say, surrender to and visit more often, just because, rather than the other ones.
All right, so I'm gonna calculate our totals here, and our average is 7.07. I don't know how we ended up with that.
707. There's another AOR band. They pump rock band. 707.
Average 7.07. Very cool. So thanks everybody for showing up tonight. This was really fun.
I just want Martin, I wanted to bring up, this is Pete Way leaves the band after this.
That's right. Yep. We lose Pete Way. And like I say, this is a real Pete Way album. I love having you here, Joe, because of this whole Chicago thing, right? That Chicago thing's amazing, right?
We all love having Joe here.
How big they were there, right? Well, and for the Chicago perspectives in general, but in this one, right? It's funny. They were just really big there, right?
And wouldn't you agree, losing Pete Way was probably losing the second most valuable player?
Yeah, and it was losing the Ace Frehley of the band, right? Or the Al Bouchard or the Bill Ward, like the just the sort of rock and roller heart of the band, right?
So if you talk about charisma levels, Pete Way's like the charisma left in that era, and he's gone.
Nikki Sixx ripped him off a lot.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
All
Well,
right.
and Steve Harris, right? Steve Harris was a big Pete fan.
And then we had Wasted.
Yeah, which is great stuff as well, right? I mean, all of that Wasted stuff is so good, especially the first album, the second album, the EP, Heaven Tonight, like all that stuff, even when Danny Vaughan came into it. So we got a lot of great music, right? Out of Michael Schenker. We got Assault Attack in 1982, right? I mean, geez, Assault Attack, Mechanix, Wasted, I often even myself forget that Wasted was there, and that was such a great band.
Do you think the name Wasted is the greatest name that Pete Way could come up with? Because that really sums up his rock and roll persona, doesn't it?
For sure. Yeah. I just love Vices to death, and the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, or whatever it's called. The Good, the Bad, and the Wasted. That's Yeah. And the EP. Yeah, that was really good material. But,
Pete had a good name to transfer into other bands. Fast Way, Wasted.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing I just want to mention. I know a lot of people say this, that UFO kind of had a ceiling to how big they could have been because a lot of people didn't like Phil Mogg's vocals. They don't think Phil Mogg's a very good singer. And I can kind of agree with that when I really think about it and take those criticisms to heart. I guess he seems to be in a tight range imaginatively of what he can do. Maybe even his physicality and his looks weren't like pretty boy good enough looks that way as well. And then even the range that his voice happens to be in is that meat and potatoes, as I can't remember who said meat and potatoes, but I thought that was perfect. About this whole era, right? Because this is the songwriting era, right? This isn't the guitar maestro era. This is the songwriting era. Right.
Yeah, well, if you look at the Michael Schenker era, he's probably he isn't really the charismatic lead in that band. Your eyes are on Schenker, or they may be on Way, but you're not really looking at the singer.
Yeah,
the singer is not the charismatic lead of the band.
Yeah, pretty interesting. And I think he's a pretty good lyricist. But again, he's the lunch bucket working man. Phil Lynott, who's probably, I think Phil Lynott's superior to Bruce Springsteen, but I mean, they're both great, but Phil Mogg is definitely one level down. He just dips his toe in that, right? And then below that, you get John Bon Jovi and all that. You know how much I hate Bon Jovi. I just have no patience for Bon Jovi, but
Martin, way below.
By the way, on my notes for the song, Terry, I had written down, sounds like Chicago. Martin hates Chicago.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
I swear it rips off a song, and I just cannot face this. So if someone can put their comments down, because it just bugged me all last night. I thought, is it a Whitesnake song? Is it a Heart song? But it just,
Well, there's this Heart song that goes, Terry, and it doesn't sound like this Terry song, but it actually is almost like the same name, and it goes into it.
But there's a chord progression.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's just someone will get it.
Well, like Ryan says, I mean, they are really kind of jumping the shark and trying that American thing the same way Rainbow stumbled in this direction. UFO is kind of stumbling in this direction. on this record. But I buy into it. I'm fine with it. And like I say, I just like, I have no control over it. I just love Mechanix.
You're a man of uncontrolled passions.
Absolutely.
Martin, that was one thing that you said that right now that was kind of interesting about Phil Mogg's vocals. I think that there was a lot of albums where, yeah, he'd never had the greatest voice, but I think he kind of made it work. I think one of the things I was noticing when I was listening to this album over again is that some of the melodies that he chose to do really just did not fit his voice at all, and it added an extra awkwardness to it.
Yeah.
So I think that like that kind of affected this album for me too, because like I've always liked him as a vocalist, but he goes in the territory sometimes that just don't work for him.
And,
yeah, and maybe lyrically, you know, he doesn't fall into this AOR thing, and then you're awkward because of that. But yeah, he's got a real rich sort of mid-range thing that he does, and it's in a tight range. But sorry, I was interrupting there.
No, so in this album, I think there's a lot of backup singers, isn't it? So maybe that was another thing to push up and give a little bit more melody in the vocal line. Did you notice that in this album? A lot of backup singing.
Okay,
Cool. I want to throw it over to Nick for the last word, just because I haven't heard you jump in yet.
Well, I've just been taking it all in. I'm taking it all in. No, it's good. It runs the gamut. Again, like I said, I didn't know that feelings ran hot or cold on this album, but it seems like I'm in there with Martin and Joe. That's good enough for me.
Yeah.
Hey, look, I love Eddie Cochran, so I find that an Eddie Cochran cover is unassailable. You guys can criticize the saxophone all you want. Bring it on. I love it. It's not like it's crazy like acid jazz sax. It fits in. And I think that someone made the point. They sound like a band. Martin said it. They sound like a band that they were having fun doing this. So
exactly. Having fun. That's a good point, Nick.
And for whatever reason, I come back to this album too. They have a lot of great albums, and I find myself coming back to it as well. I just like the sound of it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And the other thing too is you'll never be able to duplicate the Schenker era. So okay, that was the next thing they did. It was Chapman. It's a rock band. It wasn't Rocket Scientist.
Yeah.
Awesome. Very cool discussion tonight. Thanks, everybody. If you want to join our discussions, join us over at Patreon. If you want to support the channel, but you don't want to subscribe on a monthly basis, we also have a Ko-Fi account. We also have cool t-shirts like Reed is repping tonight. So thank you, Reed, for that. Thank you very much for that. We have those. The link is in the description. That's at TeePublic. Other than that, I guess we'll agree to disagree, and we'll live to fight on another day. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Everybody who's here and everybody who's watching.
See you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Guys on.
See